A good rule of thumb for these videos is if you see some code, it's really okay if you pause it and then, try to code it yourself. If you forgot where to begin, we've talked about Replit in other classes and other videos. So just in Replit, go ahead and practice these on your, by yourself. Practice the code that you're being shown. Don't just watch the video from start to finish and think that's it. Now you know it, right? Just kind of take it piece by piece, and that's really the best way to learn. Today we're going to learn about CSS Div boxes. And div boxes basically are a better way to lay out content on your web page. So let's get started. So all a div box is just short for a division box. And if you can think about it as just a way to hold information, all we're saying is we need a way to hold elements, text, images, sometimes other code. And the beauty about div boxes is we don't have to use tables anymore. And div boxes are easy to manipulate because all we're doing is using CSS code to manipulate the div. Here's an example of a div box. We're going to say div, and you see the two div tags, and inside of it is just the content for the div box itself. And it's really easy. But let's talk about the width, the height, and the overflow. And these are three things that are going to make a lot of sense to you, especially when you're writing div boxes, because if we've assigned a div box to your website, or we've created this div element, we don't know how wide it is, we certainly don't know how high it is, and what do we do if there's any overflow? So why do div boxes need a width and a height to begin with? Well, like I said earlier, if it's unknown, the width is naturally as wide as the entire browser window itself, that's the x-axis, but the y-axis is a complete unknown, because the browser makes an assumption of width and height. So let's talk about width, and we can force in CSS the width of our div box by setting the min width or the max width properties. And all we're saying is the min width will specify the smallest size a box can be displayed, and the max width is the maximum that a box can be displayed or stretched to whenever the browser is expanded. But we can also set the minimum and the max height. And earlier we talked about in the y-axis, well, what is a true y-axis of a browser? But in reality, we can set the min and the max height for our div box. In the same way that you might want to limit the width of a box on a page, we can also set it to have a minimum or a maximum height. And finally, overflow. And we're going to practice this. If you're in my class, we're actually going to practice this. So when we do this hidden and this scroll, hidden basically means any extra content that is overflow, we're going to hide it. But if there's any overflow, then it's going to create a scroll bar on the vertical axis to let you scroll up and down through the content itself. Let's talk about div box border, margin, and padding. So this is the div box model. I mean, if you have to commit this to memory, get it tattooed on your body, do whatever you got to do. But you should understand that the content is in the middle. It has a width and a height. Right after the content, we have this padding, and then we have a border, and then we have a margin. So when we're working with the div box model, let's kind of use this iPad as an example, right? So the inside of this would be the content. That's where everything sits. And then the padding would be this black border that goes around the content. That would be the padding. Then outside of the padding is an actual physical border of your div box. So then this would be it. The edge would be the border. Then the margin outside of it would be the distance between here and whatever's above or below it. That would be your margin. So in this div box model, we have a border. As I've told you, every box has a border, even if it's not visible. And you have to imagine that it doesn't matter what div you use or how you write it, every single div box has a border, even if it's specified to be 0 pixels wide. Then we have a margin that sits outside of the edge of the border. We have the padding, which is the distance between the content and the border. And finally, the content itself. So let's take a look at this. We can even specify the border width property. We can say thin, medium, thick. And we don't use percentages when we use this property. We use our pixel property. So we can say the border is going to be 10 pixels or the border is going to be 50 pixels. And we can assign it these subjective terms of thin, medium, thick too. But we don't use percentages because if you can't tell the border will have a specific width if it doesn't know if it's original content. So if it doesn't know how big it is, then it can't assign itself a percentage. But we can control the individual size of borders using these 4 separate properties: the top, right, bottom, and left. And this is going to be a common running theme in all of our CSS code: top, right, bottom, left. Again, one more thing you're gonna have to remember is whenever we write code in a linear fashion and we say we're gonna write code top, right, bottom, left, I say I do the top coordinate first, the right coordinate, the bottom coordinate, and the left coordinate. Meaning, so when we do border width, it is top, right, bottom, left, and that's the way we deal with it. So I manipulate the top first, then the right, then the bottom, and then finally the left. So if you look at this example, we're manipulating border width, top 2 pixels, right 1 pixel, bottom 1 pixel, left 2 pixels, top, right, bottom, left. And we do this clockwise order. We can also adjust the border color, the border style. And if you want, you can pause it and then look at these and then continue when you're ready. But you can read for yourself. We have solid, dotted, whatnot. And there's more border styles here too. And then again, we can individually change the style, top, right, bottom, left. So top, left. I wrote it out of order, but it's top, right, bottom, left. Or you can just assign it this way if you like. Now let's talk about padding and margins. We've covered border. Let's talk about padding and margin. Padding, same thing. We can specify the pixel density of our padding. We can say top, right, bottom, left. And notice that in this one, you can also use percentages. Border you cannot, padding you can. But in this example, we're just going to use pixels. And margin, same thing. We can assign margin. We can even we can use pixels, but we can also use percentages with this as well. It's just the distance between where one div element sits and another element. Top, right, bottom, left. Same shorthand that we're going to use. So here we are inside of REPL, and let me just kind of create a simple div. If I create a div here, and then I close it off, right? And I hit run, what should we see? And if you said nothing, that is correct. There's nothing here. Let me move this aside. There's nothing here because there's no content inside the div. But if I said div and then I said heading 1 tag and I said hello and I close it off and I run it, I spelled hello wrong. So if I create a div tag and it says hello, there's the hello right there. So first, what is the width, right? We don't know. Let's go ahead and figure it out in our CSS. So why don't we open our CSS tab? So in CSS, let's mess with the div. So I'm going to call the div and let's create some new rules. Why don't we give it a background color of, I'm going to use the implicit word red, and that's fine for right now. And if I hit run, then you can see the div box kind of stretches the whole way. So we have to set the width of the div. So we can set a width to this div too, and we'll say it's going to be 300 pixels. And there it is. We can set a height of our div too of 300 pixels. Good. Notice the word hello is smashed up against the upper left-hand corner. So how do I manipulate this? Well, I'd use something called padding, right? So padding is the distance or the spacing between the content and the border. So if I'll say padding, and I'll say 10 pixels, or let's be more visual so you can see it. We'll say 40 pixels, and I hit run. So now we have this 40 pixel space from the top and 40 pixel space from the left as well. So that was kind of this lecture through our div boxes, and that's just part 1. We're gonna start part 2 after part 1, but it kind of gives you an example of what we could do with div boxes, what div boxes are, and how you manipulate them. Like if you want, spend some time, practice writing divs, write code inside of it, on REPL, manipulate the div box, add border style, add border color, add background color, try all that stuff. Try to put 2 div boxes side by side and see what happens. Mess with the margins, okay? All right, I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye.